In December of 1985, one man decided to end Pink Floyd forever. Not by breaking up the band in the ordinary way, not by simply walking away, but by attempting something far more audacious. He tried to declare the band legally dead, to pronounce Pink Floyd extinct by his own authority, because in his mind, he was Pink Floyd, and a body cannot outlive its own soul. That man was Roger Waters, the bassist, the principal songwriter, the conceptual architect who had driven the band since Syd Barrett's departure in 1968. And what happened next is one of the strangest, pettiest, and most revealing episodes in the history of rock. A story about ego, ownership, and the brutal question that sits underneath it all. Who, exactly, owns a name? To understand why Waters did what he did, you have to understand what he believed, because he believed it completely. In his mind, the logic was airtight. He had written The Wall almost single-handedly. He had written the final cut entirely alone. He had been, for the better part of 2 decades, the vision and the voice and the will of Pink Floyd. The others, as he saw it, were talented craftsmen executing his ideas. And so, when he grew tired and disillusioned and convinced that the creative well had run dry, he reached a conclusion that felt to him like simple honesty. There was no Pink Floyd without Roger Waters. The band was, in his own words that would echo for decades, a spent force creatively. It was finished, and he had the decency to say so out loud. So in December of 1985, he did something remarkable. He did not just quit. He invoked a clause in his recording contracts, the leaving member clause, and he wrote to the record labels, to EMI and to CBS, formally notifying them that he considered Pink Floyd to be dissolved, a spent force, and releasing the labels from any further obligation to the band as an entity. Read that carefully, because it is the crux of everything. He was not simply leaving. He was trying to switch off the machine on his way out the door. He was attempting to kill the band unilaterally, to make sure that no one could carry on the name he believed belonged to him. And here is where the story takes the turn that Waters, for all his conceptual brilliance, completely failed to anticipate. David Gilmour and Nick Mason looked at his declaration that the band was dead, and they simply disagreed. They did not accept that Pink Floyd was Roger Waters to euthanize. As Gilmour put it, they were not ready to let it die, and so, rather than dissolve into the silence Waters had prescribed, they did the one thing he was certain they could never do. They carried on. They picked up the name, the legacy, the entire commercial and cultural apparatus of one of the most valuable brands in music, and they kept walking. Waters was stunned, and then he was furious. And so began one of the most bitter legal wars in the history of popular music. In October of 1986, Waters formally filed suit in the High Court in London, seeking to prevent Gilmour and Mason from using the Pink Floyd name. His argument was, at its core, philosophical, even romantic. He contended that Pink Floyd was not a corporation, not a brand, not a mere label, but the expression of a singular creative vision, his vision, and that to continue it without him was a fraud, a hollow imitation, a tribute band wearing the clothes of the real thing. It was, he insisted, a spent force, and to pretend otherwise was to deceive the public and tarnish everything the name had meant. It was a beautiful argument. It was also, in the eyes of English law, completely irrelevant. And this is the moment where the whole affair becomes almost a philosophy lesson. because the law taught Roger Waters something he had never understood. And he has told the story himself with rueful honesty when he went to the lawyers and said, in effect, listen, we are broke. This is not really Pink Floyd anymore. The band is over. The legal professionals looked at him and said something that reframed his entire universe. They told him it was irrelevant whether he felt the band was creatively finished. Pink Floyd, they explained, was a label. It had commercial value. It was an asset, a piece of property. And you cannot simply declare a valuable piece of property to have ceased existing because you personally have lost faith in it. As Waters recalled, they told him he obviously did not understand English jurisprudence. Sit with the collision happening here, because it is the whole story in miniature. Waters was making an argument about art, about soul, about authorship and meaning. And the law answered with an argument about property, about value, about ownership. He was speaking the language of the artist. The court was speaking the language of the asset. And in that courtroom, the asset won. The name Pink Floyd was not a soul that Waters could extinguish. It was a thing that could be owned. And the question was simply, who owned it? Meanwhile, the war was being fought not only in the courtroom, but in the absurd theater of petty vengeance. And one detail from this period captures the sheer smallness the feud descended into. Pink Floyd's iconic imagery included a giant inflatable pig, a symbol from the animals era, an era Waters had dominated. When Gilmour's reconstituted Pink Floyd went on tour, they wanted to use the flying pig, but the pig's design was tied up in the rights dispute, and using Waters' pig would have meant paying him a royalty, reportedly around $800 every single night. So what did they do? They redesigned the pig. Specifically, they added a large set of male genitalia to it, so that it would be, legally speaking, a different pig. A distinct pig. A pig that owed Roger Waters nothing. This is what it had come to. The men who had made some of the most profound and philosophical music of the 20th century were now in a legal argument about the anatomy of an inflatable pig. The sublime and the ridiculous, sharing the same stage. And while the lawyers argued, Gilmour did the thing that settled the matter more decisively than any court ever could. He made a record. In 1987, the Waters-less Pink Floyd released a momentary lapse of reason. Waters had bet everything on the belief that the band could not exist without him, that any Pink Floyd album made in his absence would be a transparent fraud that the public would reject. He was wrong. The album went platinum in multiple countries. The world tour that followed grossed hundreds of millions of dollars, playing to enormous crowds who did not seem remotely concerned about the absence of the man who believed he was the band's only soul. The market had rendered its verdict, and the verdict was brutal. Pink Floyd, it turned out, could sell out stadiums without Roger Waters. The spent force was making a fortune. Finally, the legal battle reached its end, and the setting could not have been more fitting for the strange intimacy of this feud between former friends. On the 23rd of December, 1987, 2 days before Christmas, the settlement was signed aboard a houseboat, Gilmour's houseboat, on the Thames. Peace on earth, negotiated on the water. The terms were never fully disclosed, but the essential shape of the deal was clear, and it was telling. Gilmour and Mason kept the name. Pink Floyd would continue to be theirs, and Waters in return retained the rights to the wall, the great conceptual work that was most purely his own creation. The soul, if you want to call it that, was divided. Waters took the album that was most his. Gilmour took the name that was, legally, everyone's. And there is a final human coda to this story, that reveals something about the passage of time and the softening of even the fiercest pride. Years later, Waters was asked about the lawsuit, about his attempt to kill the band and his failure to do so. And the man who had once been so absolutely certain that he was Pink Floyd, so convinced that the band could not and should not exist without him, gave an answer of startling simplicity. He said, "I was wrong. Of course I was. Who cares?" Think about the distance traveled in those few words. The towering conviction, the courtroom war, the pig with the added genitalia, the years of public bitterness, all of it eventually reduced to a shrug and an admission. He had been wrong. Not about the art, perhaps. He may still believe, and reasonable people may agree, that the truest Pink Floyd was the one he led. But he was wrong about the thing that actually mattered in that courtroom. He was wrong to believe that a name is a soul. A name, it turns out, is a thing you can own and lose and fail to kill. So the real question underneath this entire saga is one that has no easy answer. And it is the question that made this fight so bitter and so fascinating. What is a band, really? Is it the vision of the one person who drove it, so that without him it becomes a ghost wearing a costume, huh? Or is it a living thing larger than any single member, a name and a sound and a legacy that can survive the departure of even the man who believed he was its heart? Waters staked everything on the first answer. The law, the market, and the millions who bought the tickets all chose the second. So when you hear the name Pink Floyd, are you hearing the soul of one man or the property of a legend that outgrew him? And is it possible that the very thing that made Roger Waters a genius, his absolute certainty that he was the band, is the exact thing that guaranteed he would lose the fight to own it?